The mess hall doors swung open on a sweltering July afternoon in 1945 at Camp Swift, Texas, and the smell hit them first: hot oil, seasoned flour, and something that made even the most stoic German prisoner's stomach growl. Behind the barbed wire of this American POW camp, several dozen captured German women Luftwaffe auxiliaries, nurses, and communication staff filed in with the wary expressions of people who expected nothing good from their captors. What they saw made them stop cold. Golden brown pieces of fried chicken, glistening and piled high, sat alongside mountains of creamy mashed potatoes and gravy, buttered vegetables, soft white rolls, for women who'd survived Wehrmacht rations and the chaos of the Italian front, who'd been taught that Americans were brutal cowboys and cultural savages. The sight was almost offensive in its abundance. Hildegard Kraus, a 31-year-old communications officer from Munich, picked up a chicken leg with 2 fingers as if it might contaminate her. She held it at arm's length, studying the crispy, grease-spotted coating with the expression of a scientist examining a failed experiment. "Was ist das?" she muttered to the woman beside her. This is how Americans prepare chicken." The younger women, some barely 19, clustered around, their initial fear giving way to something between curiosity and contempt. They'd been in American custody for only 3 weeks, long enough to encounter other bewildering foods, but not long enough to shed the armor of Nazi ideology that had convinced them of German superiority in all things, including cuisine. "It looks like they rolled it in sand," said Greta Reinhardt, a former school teacher from Hamburg, her nose wrinkling, and then drowned it in fat. The laughter started small nervous titters that rippled through the German women as they examined this strange American offering. In their world, chicken was roasted whole with herbs or pounded thin for schnitzel. It was never coated in what appeared to be thick, golden breading and deep fried until it glistened with oil. The very concept seemed wasteful, crude, and excessive. Everything they'd been told about American culture confirmed on a single plate. "Das ist zu fettig," Hildegard announced to anyone listening. "Too greasy." Several women nodded in agreement, setting down their chicken pieces with theatrical distaste. Corporal James Whitaker, a farm boy from Alabama assigned to the camp's kitchen detail, watched from his post near the serving line. At 23, he'd seen enough captured Germans pass through to recognize the pattern, the initial suspicion, the cultural shock, the inevitable moment of surrender. He'd watched male POWs refuse corn on the cob as pig food, seen them save white bread for dessert because it tasted like cake, heard them complain that American coffee was too sweet, too weak, too everything. But this group of women seemed particularly offended by his fried chicken, and that stung. His grandmother's recipe, perfected over Sunday dinners in rural Alabama, had never failed to win over the skeptical. The seasoned flour mixture, the careful temperature control, the way the crust shattered perfectly when you bit through to reveal tender, juicy meat inside this was art, damn it, even if he'd never say so aloud. "Y'all might want to try it before you decide," he called out in his soft drawl, immediately regretting the suggestion. These were prisoners, not dinner guests. But something about watching them laugh at his chicken felt personal. The women ignored him or didn't understand his English. They continued their commentary in rapid German, gesturing at their plates with a mixture of amusement and disdain. One woman, barely 20, blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun, made an exaggerated gagging gesture that needed no translation. But hunger has a way of breaking through ideology. Hildegard looked around the mess hall and noticed something that gave her pause. Other German prisoners, men who'd been here longer, who'd grown familiar with American routines, were eating their chicken with what could only be described as enthusiasm. Not reluctantly, not out of desperate hunger, but with genuine appreciation. One former Wehrmacht soldier was on his second piece, his fingers shiny with grease and his expression almost blissful. She caught the eye of Otto Becker, a captain who'd arrived 3 months earlier. He grinned at her visible skepticism and held up his chicken leg like a trophy. "Versuches," he called across the hall. "Try it." Hildegard looked down at her plate. The chicken had cooled slightly, but steam still rose from the torn spot where she'd picked at it. The crispy coating had a golden brown color that she had to admit was quite appealing. And the smell sharp, savory, touched with pepper and salt, and something else she couldn't identify made her mouth water despite her prejudices. Around her, she could see other women wavering. Greta had picked up her chicken again, turning it over in her hands like an archaeologist with an artifact. The blonde girl who'd pretended to gag was now leaning over her plate, clearly inhaling the aroma when she thought no one was watching. "It's probably going to be terrible," Hildegard announced, as much to convince herself as the others. "American food is always terrible." She took a bite. The crust shattered between her teeth with a satisfying crunch that released a burst of flavor, salty, peppery, with an herbal complexity she hadn't expected. Then came the chicken itself, tender and so moist it nearly melted, the meat pulling cleanly away from the bone. The contrast between the crispy exterior and the succulent interior was remarkable. She chewed slowly, her expression frozen in concentration as her taste buds processed information that directly contradicted her expectations. "Mein Gott," she said quietly. Greta was watching her with wide eyes. Is it bad?" Hildegard looked at the chicken leg in her hand, at the bite mark revealing white meat glistening with juice. She thought of her mother's Sunday roasts back in Munich, of the careful German preparations she'd grown up with, of the superiority she'd been taught to feel about European cuisine. Then she took another bite. She began, struggling with words that felt like a betrayal of something she couldn't quite name. "It's actually extraordinary." The admission hung in the air like smoke. Greta bit into her own piece, and Hildegard watched the same transformation cross her friend's face, suspicion to surprise, to something approaching wonder. The crispy coating, the perfectly seasoned meat, the richness that somehow didn't feel heavy despite all that oil. It was unlike anything in their experience. Neither better nor worse than German cooking, but simply undeniably different. And delicious. Within minutes, the laughter in that section of the mess hall had changed character entirely. Skeptical chuckles became appreciative murmurs. Women who'd been holding their chicken at arm's length were now bent over their plates, gnawing meat from bones with unladylike enthusiasm. The blonde girl who'd gagged was licking her fingers and eyeing her neighbor's plate with obvious envy. "There's more if y'all want seconds," Corporal Whitaker called out, unable to hide his grin. The response was immediate. Hands shot up across the German section, and suddenly the captured women who'd been mocking American food 5 minutes earlier were lining up for additional servings like children at a birthday party. Hildegard found herself standing in that line, her empty plate held out like an offering, trying to reconcile the pleasure of that meal with everything she'd believed about her captors. This wasn't supposed to happen. They were prisoners of war, defeated soldiers of the Reich. The Americans were supposed to be brutal, their food crude, their culture inferior. But here she was, waiting eagerly for a second piece of fried chicken that had somehow become the best thing she'd eaten in months. As she sat back down with her refill, she noticed Captain Robert Schara observing from the mess hall entrance. The camp commander had a reputation for unexpected kindness. He'd greeted their arrival with a speech about respect and dignity that had left many Germans confused and suspicious. "Everybody will be well fed," he'd promised. "We might even enjoy some of our time." At the time, it had seemed like propaganda, like a trick. But looking around the hall now at German prisoners and American guards sharing the same fried chicken, at the tension that had defined the past weeks, softening in the presence of truly good food, Hildegard began to understand what Schara had meant. The war had taught her that enemies were monsters, but monsters didn't serve you their grandmother's fried chicken recipe. Monsters didn't make sure you got seconds. Over the following weeks, fried chicken became something of an event at Camp Swift. When it appeared on the menu, the German women no longer sneered or hesitated. They looked forward to it, discussed the subtle differences between batches, even asked Corporal Whitaker questions about preparation, stumbling conversations in broken English and hand gestures that somehow communicated the universal language of cooking. Greta, who taught English literature before the war, became an informal translator. She wants to know, she explained to Whitaker one afternoon, pointing at Hildegard, what you put in the coating, the spices. Whitaker grinned and rattled off ingredients. Paprika, black pepper, garlic powder, a secret blend his grandmother swore by. The women listened with the intensity of scholars taking notes, already imagining how they might recreate this recipe in whatever future awaited them back in devastated Germany. But it wasn't just the chicken. Once the Germans overcame their initial prejudices, a cascade of American foods followed. They learned that corn on the cob, which they dismissed as a livestock feed, was actually sweet and satisfying when buttered and salted properly. They discovered that soft white bread, which they'd mocked as cake-like, made excellent toast and absorbed gravy in ways their dense rye bread never could. They found that cornbread, that yellow, crumbly creation they'd once called animal fodder baked into bread, was actually delightful with butter and honey. So much so that the women at one camp reportedly asked for it every day. When Hildegard was repatriated to Germany in early 1946, she carried with her something unexpected: a carefully written recipe for Southern fried chicken, translated into German by Greta and verified through multiple test batches with Corporal Whitaker's patient guidance. The paper was creased from being folded and unfolded, stained with grease in one corner from when she tried to follow it in the camp kitchen. She also carried memories that didn't fit the narrative she'd been taught, memories of American guards who treated her with respect, of a mess hall where former enemies shared meals and sometimes even laughter, of the moment when a single bite of fried chicken had cracked open her certainty about who was civilized and who was not. Years later, living in a rebuilt Munich, she would serve that same fried chicken recipe to her family. Her children would ask where she learned to cook something so unusual, so un-German. And Hildegard would tell them about a prison camp in Texas where the food was better than anything she'd eaten during the war, where American soldiers had shown more kindness than she'd thought possible, where a corporal from Alabama had inadvertently taught her that culture and humanity couldn't be measured by the food on your plate, but that sharing a good meal could somehow bridge the distance between worlds. We laughed at them, she would say, shaking her head at the memory. We thought we were so superior, so sophisticated. We called their chicken greasy garbage, and then we tasted it and everything changed. Her daughter would watch her mother's face as she spoke, seeing something complex and conflicted there. Gratitude mixed with regret, pleasure shadowed by guilt. Was it really that good? The daughter would ask, and Hildegard would smile just a little. Liebling, it was extraordinary. That was the problem. Because in the end, it hadn't just been about the chicken. It had been about the uncomfortable realization that enemies could be kind, that the inferior culture could create something beautiful, that everything she'd believed might have been wrong. A piece of fried chicken hadn't won the war, but it had won a small battle for her soul. The battle against the hate and certainty that had been planted there by years of propaganda. In mess halls across America during those strange years of 1944 and 1945, thousands of German prisoners underwent similar transformations, one meal at a time. They arrived expecting brutality and found abundance. They came prepared to starve and instead gained weight. They brought prejudices that crumbled like fried chicken crust at the first bite. It was, perhaps, the most unexpected form of victory, not through force or intimidation, but through the simple, radical act of hospitality, of serving your enemies the same food you'd serve your family.